The jungle was quiet that morning, too quiet for men who had been at war for months. The air was thick and wet, hanging over the ground like a heavy blanket. Giant trees blocked most of the sunlight, leaving the forest floor in dark green shadow. Insects buzzed constantly, and somewhere far away a bird cried out, then fell silent again. Deep inside that jungle, hidden beneath layers of vines and leaves, Japanese tank crews sat inside their armored machines and waited. They believed the jungle was their shield. No American
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.
tank could possibly reach them here. The ground was too soft, the trees too thick, the terrain too narrow. Steel machines belonged on roads and open ground, not inside this tangled forest. At least, that was what they believed. Inside one of those tanks, a young Japanese driver wiped sweat from his eyes. Even with the hatch slightly open, the heat inside the steel hull was unbearable. The tank smelled of fuel, oil, and damp uniforms. The crew had been in position since before sunrise, engines off, listening. Their commander, a lieutenant from the Imperial Japanese Army's 9th Tank Regiment, had ordered them to remain silent. No movement unless American infantry appeared on the narrow jungle track ahead. They were certain that if the Americans came, they would come on foot. Tanks could not move through jungle like this, not even the powerful American machines. What the Japanese tankers did not know was that several kilometers away, American armored crews were preparing to do something most soldiers believed was impossible. The date was July 23, 1944. The location was the island of Guam in the western Pacific Ocean. Only 2 days earlier, United States Marines and Army troops had stormed the beaches in one of the most intense amphibious assaults of the Pacific War. The Japanese defenders had prepared for months. Their plan was simple and brutal. Let the Americans land, draw them inland, then destroy them with carefully hidden positions, artillery, and tanks waiting in ambush. The jungle terrain was their ally. Thick vegetation, steep ridges, and narrow trails made movement slow and dangerous. To Japanese planners, this environment favored defense. But the Americans had brought something new into the jungle, something heavy, loud, and determined. M4 Sherman tanks. At first glance, the idea seemed reckless. The Sherman was a powerful machine, weighing over 30 tons and armed with a 75mm main gun. It was designed to fight across fields and roads, not crawl through tangled forests where trees pressed tightly together and mud swallowed tracks. But American commanders on Guam faced a difficult reality. Japanese defenses were deeply dug into jungle hillsides. Infantry alone could not break them quickly. They needed armored support. If the tanks could not reach the battlefield, the battle might stall. So American engineers and tank crews began studying the jungle. They cut paths. They pushed through undergrowth. They tested the ground and marked routes that looked barely wide enough for a truck, let alone a tank. Bulldozers worked day and night, often under sniper fire. Sometimes the engineers had to blow apart trees with explosives just to create a passage wide enough for Sherman tracks. Slowly, painfully, the Americans carved narrow armored corridors into the jungle. The work often happened at night. Engineers from the U.S. Navy construction battalions, better known as the Seabees, joined Army combat engineers to widen jungle trails. They used machetes, axes, bulldozers, and explosives. Sometimes the only light came from small shielded lamps, so Japanese observers could not see them. The jungle resisted every step. Thick roots twisted under the ground. Swamps swallowed equipment. Rain turned paths into deep mud. But the Americans kept working because they knew that once tanks entered the jungle, the balance of the fight would change. And on that humid morning in July, the first Sherman tanks began to move. Inside one of those tanks was Sergeant William Bill Carter, a tank commander from the U.S. Army's 706th Tank Battalion. Carter had fought in the Pacific for months, but this was different from anything he had seen before. The jungle pressed so tightly around the tank that branches scraped constantly against the turret. Sometimes the driver could barely see more than a few meters ahead. The tank moved slowly, its engine roaring in the confined green tunnel. Carter leaned halfway out of the commander's hatch, binoculars raised, scanning the narrow path ahead. Sweat ran down his face and soaked his helmet liner. The jungle smelled of wet earth and rotting leaves. Every shadow looked like it might hide a Japanese soldier. Behind his Sherman came several more tanks, moving in single file. Infantry from the U.S. Army's 77th Infantry Division walked beside them, rifles ready, eyes fixed on the jungle around them. The soldiers knew Japanese troops often hid in trees or deep foxholes. Ambush could come from anywhere. Still, the tanks kept moving. Far ahead, inside their concealed positions, Japanese tank crews waited patiently. Their vehicles were Type 95 Heigo light tanks and several heavier Type 97 Chiha medium tanks. Compared to American Shermans, they were smaller and lighter, but in the jungle, they believed that did not matter. They were positioned along narrow trails where American infantry would have to pass. When the moment came, they would strike fast and hard. Lieutenant Kenji Takahashi, commanding one of the Japanese tank platoons, checked his watch. It was just after 0800 hours. Reports from forward observers suggested American troops were advancing through the jungle again after heavy fighting the previous day. Takahashi was confident in his position. The jungle around them was thick enough to hide an entire armored unit. He looked toward the narrow path cutting through the trees. Nothing moved. Then, faintly at first, he heard something. A distant mechanical rumble. At first, Takahashi thought it might be trucks or artillery being repositioned somewhere along the American lines, but the sound grew louder, deeper, a steady metallic grinding mixed with the roar of powerful engines. His brow tightened. No truck engine sounded like that. Inside Carter's Sherman, the driver pushed the throttle carefully. The tank crushed smaller plants and saplings beneath its tracks. The path ahead curved slightly, disappearing behind a wall of thick trees. Carter could feel tension building in his crew. Everyone knew Japanese forces were nearby. Every meter forward could trigger an ambush. Suddenly, the infantry walking ahead raised their hands. "Stop!" The Sherman halted, engine idling. One of the American scouts crouched low and pointed toward the ground. Tank tracks, fresh ones. Carter's pulse quickened. Japanese armor was somewhere close. He lowered himself inside the turret. "Gunner ready," he said calmly. The Sherman's gunner adjusted the sights on the 75-millimeter cannon. The loader grabbed a high-explosive round and prepared to feed it into the breech. Outside, the jungle was silent again. Then the Sherman moved forward. Branches snapped as the tank pushed around the curve in the path. And suddenly, through a gap in the trees, Carter saw something that made his heart race. A Japanese tank. The Type 95 Heigo sat partially hidden behind thick vegetation, barely 20 meters away. Its turret began turning toward the American machine, the surprised Japanese crew scrambling to react. For a split second, both crews stared at each other through the jungle. Neither had expected tanks here. Carter reacted first. "Fire!" The Sherman's cannon roared. The blast echoed through the jungle like thunder. Birds exploded out of the trees as the shells smashed into the thin armor of the Japanese tank. The Hago erupted in smoke and flame, its turret jerking violently. American infantry scattered for cover as the sound of battle suddenly filled the forest. From deeper in the jungle came shouting in Japanese. Engines roared to life as more hidden tanks tried to maneuver. But now, the jungle no longer belonged to them. One by one, Shermans pushed forward through the trees. For Japanese crews who believed they were protected by terrain, the shock was immediate and terrifying. The thick jungle that had hidden them now trapped them. Their lighter tanks struggled to maneuver quickly between trees. Shermans, with their powerful engines and wider tracks, forced their way forward, smashing smaller trunks and pushing through brush. Within minutes, the quiet jungle turned into a chaotic, armored battle fought at incredibly close range. Sergeant Carter spotted another Japanese tank moving behind a cluster of palms. The enemy vehicle tried to reposition for a shot, but the narrow terrain limited its movement. "Target, left side," Carter shouted. The Sherman's turret swung smoothly. The gun fired again. Another explosion. The Japanese tank's armor could not withstand the Sherman's gun at such close distance, yet the fight was far from easy. Japanese crews fought fiercely. Several managed to fire back, their shells striking trees and sending splinters flying through the air. One American Sherman was hit in the track, immobilizing it in the narrow path. Infantry rushed forward to protect the crippled tank as the crew continued firing from its turret. The jungle itself became part of the battle. Fallen trees blocked movement. Smoke hung low under the canopy. Visibility sometimes dropped to only a few meters. Crews relied on instinct and training as much as sight. Lieutenant Takahashi watched in disbelief as the American tanks advanced deeper into the jungle. His carefully prepared ambush had assumed infantry would come first. Instead, the Americans had sent armored monsters crashing directly into the defensive positions. He shouted orders for his remaining tanks to reposition along a secondary trail. But the jungle was now filled with Shermans. American tank crews were adapting quickly, coordinating with infantry to locate Japanese armor hidden in vegetation. Engineers followed behind, widening paths so more tanks could enter the fight. By midday, the battlefield looked completely different from what Japanese commanders had expected. Instead of trapped American infantry, it was Japanese armor struggling to escape destruction in terrain they once believed was safe. Sherman crews pushed forward slowly, methodically. They used short bursts of movement, stopping often so infantry could search the thick jungle around them. Machine guns mounted on the tanks rattled constantly, firing into suspicious bushes and tree lines. Every movement in the jungle could be a hidden enemy soldier carrying explosives or a magnetic mine. The Americans had learned hard lessons in the Pacific. Japanese troops sometimes attacked tanks at extremely close range, trying to disable them with satchel charges. That was why infantry protection was critical. Soldiers from the 77th Division stayed close to the tanks, watching every shadow, ready to fire instantly if someone emerged from the jungle. Several hours into the battle, another group of Japanese tanks attempted a counterattack near the village of Barrigada. Their goal was to break through the advancing American line and hit the infantry formations supporting the Shermans. But the plan collapsed quickly. American tanks were already positioned along the jungle trail, waiting. At around 14:30 hours, the first Japanese tank rolled forward through the trees and immediately faced two Shermans positioned behind fallen logs. The American gunners had clear fields of fire. The first shot struck the lead Japanese tank squarely in the hull. Flames burst from the engine compartment. The rest of the Japanese vehicles tried to turn away, but the jungle limited their movement again. Shermans advanced steadily, firing as they moved, their larger guns and thicker armor giving them a decisive advantage. By late afternoon, smoke drifted through the jungle canopy as the fighting slowly faded. Burned-out Japanese tanks stood silent among shattered trees and churned mud. Sergeant Carter climbed out of his Sherman and stood on the turret, stretching his stiff legs. The jungle was quieter again now, but the smell of burned metal and fuel hung in the air. American infantry moved carefully through the area, checking destroyed vehicles and searching for any surviving enemy soldiers. Carter looked around at the damaged trees and crushed undergrowth where his tank had pushed forward only hours earlier. None of them had expected armored combat like this inside a jungle, but the battle had proven something important. Terrain alone could no longer guarantee safety. The Sherman tanks continued pushing forward, their engines roaring beneath the jungle canopy. And for the first time in that war, Japanese tankers realized that the jungle was no longer their shield. It had become their trap.
If you want more content like this, subscribe now and comment below.